giving talks and presentations on ESD. He's also the gentleman who's developed pink polystatic material, as well as a number of other devices used for measuring and detecting static discharges, as well as other packaging devices and material to protect against ESD. And he's also, what does it say here? He's also
gosh, I'm on again. Y'all read me out there. If I stuff this in my pocket up here, and everybody in the back read me all right, I'm never sure. Good Lord. As a gentleman very kindly told you, you see before you the mortal remains of some idiot named Anderson. And I'm president of a little company called Anderson Effects. Prior to that, I was vice president of Richmond Technology there for about 20 years. Just retired, so I'm doing my own thing now. I don't know, they hired me back as a consultant making more than I was making when I worked for them, which makes me wonder what took me so long. It's kind of weird. However, when your act is as bad as mine, you travel a lot. You know, so the guy with the short barrel cannot keep you in the sight. At any rate, we're the people who invented antistatic plastics by 1966, and it was in response to a strange incident down at Cape Kennedy. How many of y'all know about clean rooms? Anybody ever seen a clean room? And weird, man, that ain't no place for a claustrophobe, is it? You know, they came into being back at Cape Kennedy about 1960. Between 1958 and early 1959, NASA traced 75% of their missile launch failures when the thing either blew up on the pad or for whatever reason failed to complete the mission. They traced that to something they like to call particulate contamination. That's a $4 word for dust, right? They talk to each other like that. Look, you got a grain of dust in a relay and it ain't going to close, man. You got a grain of dust in a liquid oxygen valve and that snaps shut on it. That promptly ignites, and what that does is to clean the pad for a 400-foot radius. I mean, you get some rather spectacular results from microscopic junk. So NASA put in the clean room by 1958. The whole motto was let there be no dust. Man, you couldn't go in a room like that with anything going to make dust, right? You couldn't have paper because it sheds fibers. You couldn't write your name with a pencil because the dust off that pencil point is not only dirt, that's conductive dirt. You want to sprinkle graphite in your TV set to make the knobs turn easier? It's short wherever it falls, man. I mean, it gets downright spectacular, right? Microelectronics, you can't do that with anymore. The other side of the room. You couldn't go in a room like that with normal clothing. You had special low-shedding bunny suits. You could get in that room with dandruff. Now, I was free to go in there. But they greased your eyebrows and they put a snoot on your beard because they weren't kidding. Look, think about it for a minute. NASA had a lot of reliability requirement. It's hard to match, man. How do you rehearse a takeoff from the moon? Man, that has to work the first time, Charlie Brown, right? You got one shot at that one. You know, if a computer goes wrong or a switching gear goes wrong, you run out, jerk out the circuit board, bring it back in there, and change out the bad component after you find it, and you put the thing back in business, right? But suppose you're sitting on top of the moon, right, on the limb, right, and you're fixing to press a button to leave, right? And one of those 400,000 devices gives up in there all of a sudden. We will see you around, and around, and around. You ain't coming home, Charlie. That's exactly what's that, right? And when you realize that all those things are furnished by the low bidder, it's a sobering thought. Anyway, so they began to find out. They put it in the clean room. Now, once you had cleaned the part to the gnat's whisker, they had that about as clean as you can get it with ultrasonically agitated freon and all this junk. Now, you came out of that bath with a part that was about as clean as humans knew how to get it. We got to keep it clean. So they went out and got them some nice, clean polyethylene bags, you know, from a local supermarket, not knowing that all those bags are dusted all over their surfaces with talcum or cornstarch to keep them from sticking to themselves, right? Right away, the microscope said tilt. And these guys, three guys about 1960, went to making what they call the world's emptiest bags. They extruded that polyethylene in the form of a closed tube, around the bubble of filtered dry nitrogen inside that tube would not only be clean, it would be sterile, right? Nothing ever seen inside that. And to make a bag out of that tubing, you just sliced it over here and sealed it over here and sliced it over there, right? Neither one of those had ever separated the wall, so that goes down there and it's ultra clean. And now this guy's got to put this clean part in this clean bag, right? So what's he got to do? Now he just sucked into that bag the first atmosphere it ever saw, right? Including every airborne particle for 40 feet against the wind, you know, because it shed it off of him. Secondly, when he separated those walls, he put a static charge on both of them, and they acted like the front of your CRT, man. They started attracting dust. You ever notice how the front of your CRT gets dusty? Man, we used to get letters from Rockwell. Dear sir, the ultra-clean polyethylene bags that you have furnished to this facility contain red hair. And my red-headed technician said so. And there was nothing there when they left, but that wasn't the worst part about that. You put a sharp-edged object in a polyethylene bag, and it gets busy combing off polyethylene dust inside that bag, man. See what I mean? It would actually, the bag could dirty itself up. So about 1961, when I was young and sanitary, I was working for Allied Chemical, and we switched them over to using nylon film. I mean, the ladies are familiar with that. You know, you cook a turkey in a nylon bag, melts at 428F, give or take nothing. So they made the nylon bags. They're tough and abrasion resistant, man. You put the sharp-edged object in that, it doesn't come off to the nylon. So they wrap them up in these ultra-clean nylon bags and overwrap them with a cheaper polyethylene bag, because the polyethylene would give them a little moisture barrier. Nylon lets moisture vapor go through it like it ain't there. Nothing else passes through it with moisture vapor does. Kind of a weird thing. Anyway, nylon became known as the intimate barrier. It was the inside bag. It was right next to whatever it was you were proudest of. And nylon is often observed in that configuration. Anyway, it turned out that these two films had this weird property that they generated static like it's going out of style. I got to take all of you back to General Science 1. Look, when I lecture at MIT and JPL, I often wonder what I'm doing there with my $4, because there's not generally a guy in the room that hadn't forgotten more about electronics than I'm ever likely to learn. I'm fond of saying my knowledge of electronics would fit comfortably under the average contact lens. However, we find it universally true that most of them have forgotten General Science 1, and they have a somewhat distorted idea of the behavior of static electricity, because the last time you did anything with that was, you know, stroking the cat and playing with the pin balls, right? I mean, it's kind of weird. So let's take it back for a minute. To begin with, what you're going to see is not so much designed to show you as it is to show you how to show somebody. Because 90% of your problem is convincing the lady that's wearing that ground strap that it isn't designed so she can't go for coffee. This is slave labor, man. You got me chained to this table. I mean, a lot of people felt that way. You got to know. Look here. Static electricity, to begin with, static electricity ain't going nowhere. It's standing still. That's what the word static means, man. We misuse the term a lot. I heard the static in the radio, right? What you heard was the RF pulse. It was produced by the discharge, or what it up to then had been, a static charge. The static charge, by definition, ain't going anywhere, standing still, right? But the discharge is very dynamic indeed. However, static is also a surface phenomenon. No surface, no static, which is why pure gases don't generate it, man. You got to have surface. Whenever two surfaces come together, no matter how lightly they touch, one of them likes electrons better than the other. And as you peel them apart, one of them, even if they're apparently identical, triboelectric series be damned, there's no such thing as two surfaces which are totally identical. So as you peel those things apart, one of them plucks electrons off the other. Easy way is to show it with Scotch tape. See, when you unroll it, the main roll plucks off electrons, right? And that leaves this piece plus, because it lost them. It's like two guys sit down at a poker table. One of them gets up rich. Don't come out even. You can see if both of those things, when they separated, were conductive, this could have run home in the moment of separation, right? But if one of those separating surfaces, just one, is a relatively dry non-conductor, the charge stays in place on it and is therefore called, guess what, a static charge. It ain't going nowhere. Easy way to show it. Can I borrow your right hand, my lady, just like at rehearsal? What is your front name? What is your front name? Marlene, I want you to know that of all the girls I have ever met, you are certainly one of them. Well, hold that right there. I notice these things, man. You hold that right there. When you unroll this thing, it comes off with a healthy plus charge and goes looking for something, right? In this case, it gets attracted to the lady, for which I don't blame it the slightest. On the other hand, her touching it couldn't ground it because it's a non-conductor. So it's still got the charge. Here comes another plus charge piece. And these two don't like each other. See, they push each other apart with a start thing about a push because the charges are alike. You see, likes repel, unlikes attract. It's like boy, boy, girl, girl, except in Hollywood. Now, these are standing there, and they're slowly but surely attracting from the surrounding atmosphere the little airborne negative ions in the room. They push the plus ions away. You can sometimes add to the population of ions with one of these things. I've been taking Clint Eastwood lessons. This is one of them little piezoelectric generators. You squeeze this, you get a 25,000 volt corona and a rush of plus ions, and nothing happens because I don't like plus ions. But when I let go of it, I get a little negative ion. See a little diminution in that repulsion every time I let go of that? See how that works? From now on, everybody going to stand in his workstation with one of these and do this at 60 hertz all day long. Work with the other hand. Come on. A couple of things wrong with that. The charge had to be on that plastic to invite that ion over to neutralize it, right? I mean, otherwise it couldn't have attracted that ion. However, whenever you squeeze that thing, though, it makes sparks, and radios hear sparks. That goes back to some fellow named Marconi. I'm a little late getting here with the news, right? Okay, when you want to find out if you've had a spark, you can go out and buy one of these Anderson Effects ESD spark detectors and shielding evaluator. In an emergency, it functions as a 698 transistor radio, okay? But you tune that up off of a station, right? And listen to it. Sounds like zaps, don't it? Every time I squeeze that corona makes all sorts of noise. Can you imagine what would happen to your software if you were triggering one of these things around and come on? Don't do that. However, there's another way. 3M will sell you an air ionizer for $500 per table per workstation per year. It's full of radioactive materials, you know, and it doesn't make any EMI or RF, but it fills the air with ions, and its entire job is to cause the slow collapse of those tapes. That's what it's for. $500 per tape, or you could use one of these as a cigarette lighter, you know. Do that. Works for you. This we sell for $395. You have to know a little bit more about it than that, okay? Otherwise you get to be a sucker for some of the stuff. This is why you don't have any trouble with zapping things as they pass over the wave solder, because the heat right over that wave solder, man, dissipates any charge you got on that board sparklessly. Okay? So it does very, very well. Anybody have a question so far, or are you staying with me? Good. Okay. Anybody want to guess how much charge was on that just because I unrolled it? Mind you, didn't have to rub two Boy Scouts together. A lot of people think you got to rub things. You see, that's what the triboelectric theory is based on. The Greek word to rub. You know, they used to think you had to rub things to get charge. But see, rubbing things just multiplies the number of times you kiss and get off, and kiss and get off, right? And the more times you kiss and get off, the greater the charge. Okay. If you ever want to measure and figure out how much is on there, use a static meter. How many of you have seen static meter? Let's see hands. Anybody seen static meter? Yeah. Ever seen a big pistol? There's one made like a big pistol that's made by 3M or distributed by 3M. Got radioactivity in it. Looks like a 4-pound flare gun. Marked radioactive. You ever try to walk on an airplane with a 4-pound pistol marked radioactive? Yeah. I'm going to hold that for a minute, sir, just like at rehearsal there. This is an Anderson meter. It's a real financial pleasure if you specify these, but it isn't a plug. There's many of them. That's a nationalistic pink, no radioactivity. You set it at 0, which is in the center, found somewhere near the middle. These are all calibrated by pointing them at the center of a square foot of charged metal sheet, 6 inches away from them, in a Faraday cage, which is a wire screen structure in which a radio ceases to receive. Anybody think radios play in Faraday cages? Good. Take a look at that. We got nothing on this tape yet until I separate it, at which time that goes plus and that goes minus by several thousand volts. Okay? And incidentally, if you can't afford one of those meters, there is a cheaper way. Stand steady there in the ranks. Would you hold that about that level, my lady, just like at rehearsal? While I make an ash of myself here, you put some cigarette ashes on a flat surface. This is a poor man's static meter. If you can't afford one, if you can't afford a static meter, this is damn near as accurate and considerably less expensive. You unroll your tape 1 inch above the ashes, right? And if you can pick them up from 1 inch, you have a minimum charge of 4,000 volts on the surface of that tape. That's 4,000 plus on the piece that unrolled and 4,000 minus on the surface from which it unrolled. So between those two is a difference in potential of some 8,000 volts looking for some place to happen, right? Hadn't happened yet because we ain't had any sparks yet. See, we're still playing with non-conductors, right? The ladies have a problem with static cling. You know how the skirts get affectionate every now and then? This is your skirt, honey, and this is your substrate, okay? And as that lets loose, man, it wants to go home. No, that's kind of interesting. So everybody's aware of that. Look, the front of your TV set picks up dust, right? You ever notice that? Because it better have a flush charge, or it couldn't attract the electrons from the gun behind it. Okay? Now you've just seen static's entire repertory. As long as it is static, on a non-conductor, man, it can do two things. It can cause the attraction of something of an unlike charge, and it can cause a repulsion of something of a like charge. Big fat deal, right? That's all. So there is no such thing as a static sensitive component. There is no such thing as static damage. They are sensitive too, and the damage is done by static discharge. And short is not until that charge decides to go somewhere with SR, or startling rapidity, in the form of a fat little spark, man, that you have any problem with setting fires, setting off explosives, fogging film, attracting or damaging electronic devices, right? In short, no spark, no damage, right? Everybody got that? Repeat after me, class. ESD is a spark, class. ESD is a spark. Once more. ESD is a spark. Have that transcribed and rebroadcast. Incredible. Man, they talk about fields doing this, that, and the other. Man, there's a field around a transmission line that would fry you, you know. And the bird lights on that 40,000 volt transmission line, has lunch, and flies off, right? Until you ground the other side of that bird, in which case you've got fried chicken. Right? See, people forget that. Okay, this is how it works. Okay, now, so let's look at what happens daily. I start walking, that spark, man, doesn't happen between non-conductors. You don't make a spark gap out of Teflon. You make your spark gap out of the best conductor you can get your pinkies on, okay? Now, there are only 3 of them. They are metal, like the doorknob in a wooden door over there, will accept a spark, right? Doesn't make the slightest bit of difference whether that's a solid metal doorknob or a plastic doorknob plated with metal. It's strictly a capacitor plate and strictly the surface. It has anything to do with it, right? Same size spark. If I want a bigger spark, guess what I do? I ground the doorknob. Now I got the entire earth as the other half of that capacitor plate. That's the largest thing I can get hold of, right? I can throw the largest possible spark. Another thing that would accept spark is anything that's made with black metallic carbon on its surface, like the black velostats and things like that. You've seen these things? That's a metal. Well, you can prove that right quickly. Oh, the third thing that makes the spark is you, because on the outside of your skin, which is where the charge is anyway, there's a salt water layer, you know, all over the surface of your skin, and that makes you pretty conductive, right? Just for fun. Man, would you reach up with your right hand and hold the probe of this little thing that doesn't bite? Give me your other hand there, your free hand, or the one that's reasonable. Yes, so you stick it up there. And look at here. We have connected our sweat layers, which can be fun. And you notice that if I touch this lady's pinky only on a fingernail, man, I don't get that because the fingernail doesn't sweat. The palm sweats, right? Everybody see that? The back of her hand is a little bit drier, so I have to add to that area of contact, right? But if my wrist strap goes all the way around you, got a good grab. But you see how that works? We use this as a magic console to make sure nobody breaks the chain during the seance. Unfortunately, a lot of things that are black, and you wouldn't hold it up about that level like a table. We got here a piece of black veloctat, which is about 55% black carbon loaded material. But carbon comes two ways. It comes in that amorphous black carbon form of soot, which doesn't conduct anything. And see, I check this from finger to finger, and I come down on that, and that black stuff not conductive, right? That's like the pigment in your black electrical tape. It's not going to, that was conductive granules in that would spoil your whole day when you wrapped up a tape with it, right? But this other material, this black veloctat, is a conductor. That's 55% ground up battery poles. That's a metal, okay? So if I reach for that, I will make a spark, right? Three things make sparks there: metal, carbon, and you, okay? You know, fortunately, I can't do it to me, though, because I'm the same all over. Here's the head of the physics department at Jet Propulsion Laboratories, right? This guy is not stupid. But you hand him his first static meter, and he points it in his other hand and says, gee, it doesn't work. And then the sucker light goes on. Man, if that works, you have an artificial arm, Charlie. See, your two hands are alike, man. Otherwise, you could zap your own nose. Isn't it fortunate you can't do that, man? Otherwise, every time you reach for your ear, you would knock the whey out of yourself. I can think of conditions. Well, never mind. Okay. So the good Lord arranged that you can't zap yourself, right? So here's what happened. Here I come. I'm walking across the floor, right? My non-conductive shoe sole is feeling free of that carpet, just like the Scotch tape was, right? Now the sole of that shoe has now got 5,000 or 10,000 volts on it, depending on what I separated it from, right? Okay, now that would happen if I walked on a dry steel floor. The rubber belt's charge coming off the steel pulley, right? And that charges up now. Now I got 5K on the bottom of my shoe, and if I tried to zap this guy with a shoe, I couldn't do it. You ain't about to throw a spark with a non-conductor, not at these voltages, fair. So the next step is, the field around that shoe has got to induce some part of that charge on the nearest conductor. And that happens to be the sweaty sole of my foot, right? So now it gets induced on that sweat layer, and it spreads evenly over this Van de Graaff generator ball up here, right? Which I bear a startling family resemblance. And I start looking for somebody, right? And if I touch this gentleman on the nose, he would probably give me a fat lip, and this is retaliation because he knows karate and kung fu and several other Chinese words, all right? Now, I could cross this room for 30 years without the slightest spark, right? Until I reach for one of three things. The doorknob and the wooden door over there would accept that spark, right? Anything faced with metal. Anything faced with black carbon is going to accept that spark to do it, right? And the third thing that would accept that spark is somebody besides me. I can't do it to me. Understand? Everybody understand? So how many of you guys ever slid your tail across a vinyl seat cover on a winter day and kissed your girl and raised her morale considerably? She's been everywhere, I can tell that. That's one of the few things in life I've seen I could look down on and still approve of. We're walking along here doing that stuff. Now everybody's done that, but think about what it really took to do that. It took one dry non-conductor, namely to separate your pants or the seat covers to separate to cause that charging, right? Then it had to be picked up on another conductor, namely you, right? Spread all over your skin. Then it had to be discharged at a second conductor, namely her, right? So for every instance of ESD, you got to have one dry non-conductor to separate from something, one conductor to pick it up, and another conductor to catch it, without exception. In short, you've got always a rug, a feller, and a doorknob. Okay? In every case. All right, now, up to now it was horseplay. Down at Cape Kennedy in 1964, there weren't any anesthetics. I'm the guy that invented them. And in Cape Kennedy in 1964, they're squatted on a spin test stand a 4 Delta third stage solid propellant rocket made into an orbiting solar observatory satellite. Mind you, man, the people that put that thing together were not dumb. That was the finest telemetry ever figured out to that point by the mind of man. Not a dummy in that bunch. But shoved up the tail of that thing in order to fire it was an igniter squib which looked like this. This is an aluminum cylinder. This is a bridge wire, like the filament of a light bulb. It's got 2 leads to it. It's going to get hot when you feed the current in, right? Now you got a 15, curled around that heatable filament is a wad of lead stiffenates. You might think of it as like a head of a match. It's going to burst into flame when you heat the filament. Now we have a 15-second fuse, like the delay train on the hand grenade, that will burn for 15 seconds and set off this wad of tetril, which is a very sharp, brisson explosive. Going to burst the squib, fire the solids, and send that rocket whichever way it's going. Now, since this is tied down on a spin test stand and a hangar full of technicians, NASA has no particular desire to feed current to that bridge wire. So they give it to the electrical engineering boys and say, make that thing safe. And they promptly did so. They dead shorted that thing, man. Twisted the leads together and ran it off to a nice, safe, solid ground, which is about as safe as electrical engineering in those days permitted you to get. There is no conceivable manner in which you can feed current across that bridge wire. It is twisted together, solidly grounded and shielded by an aluminum cylinder. And hanging over the bird was a large polyethylene bag, a drape, a dust cover like you'd have over your laundry. They rolled it back out of the way and made their adjustments to the bird, pull the tape loose and let that cover unroll. As it unrolled, it did the Scotch tape bit in spades, right? Generated on that curtain approximately 37,000 volts. Now that plastic curtain is not going to throw a spark, fellas. Plastics don't do that. It looks for a feller it can induce on the nearest conductor, right? It charges up the feller here, right? And that feller, that piece of metal, is looking for another piece of metal at which it can discharge, preferably a grounded one that makes the spark bigger. One of you engineers care to point that one out? Right through there, man. 15 seconds later, that thing went off in place and fried 3 men alive in their tracks. Put 11 men in the hospital. Throw the laboratory, the satellite, and all into absolutely unrecognizable junk. April 1964, the X-248 explosion. And out of that instant, man, you got to know that was suddenly static electricity stood up on its hind legs, fellas, and said, let's take a look at what I can do. Right? Out of the instant, there came a couple of requirements. One, let's learn how to short squibs. 10 decays. One stupid little solder joint jumped the bridge and that gap would have stopped that. Would have had you and your girl already holding hands where you couldn't have thrown a spark at her. Right? Other thing is that they had to have a cover they can bring into that room where they fire you for writing your name with a pencil. They couldn't do that. And the first thing they thought of was a black Palestine. How many of you guys have seen that? Man, the only trouble was you brought that to Cape Kennedy. See, they thought this was great because it was conductive. You separate 2 conductors and nothing charges, right? However, that was blacker than a yard up a chimney, and you got a black bag full of dynamite caps and a pair of scissors, you are in deep yogurt. You know, you would like to know where they are, right? Is there anything in the bag? Is it broken? Is it there, for that matter? And you have to pay attention, otherwise I feel like the whole thing is for nothing. The carbon, secondly, if I reach for that carbon, it would be a spark, right? And you remember the radio heard the spark? That tiny little radio a while ago? If I walk across, how many of you guys walked over, touched the door, and I felt that little zap? You know how much you just threw at the door? 3,500 volts. Minimum. That's a minimum a human can detect. You can't feel it under that or hear it or see it, right? But you got devices out there that die with a discharge of 12 volts. Completely, man. They never again function. You can light up neon bulbs with 90, right? Pass a neon bulb back and forth, light it up, man. And jeepers, if it can do that, it can destroy any circuit boards you got. Anyway, whenever that spark jumps, that radio cracks like a rifle one time. Repeat after me. My finger is a single shot. My finger is a single shot. You got one zap per nose, right? One zap per doorknob. And you got to reload to fire it up. Okay? Okay. So we're going to try that. And they threw that out because it not only shed conductive particles, but it would spark if you reached for it and you couldn't see through it, right? Oh, there's one other thing. When it was brought up against a dissimilar metal, it ate the metal off because it formed a 3-volt battery. That's exposed carbon, right? How many of y'all have seen the black conductive foam you jam the leads of devices into to dead short them? Both the British Minister of Defense and Sandia Labs found out just leave them alone a while, it'll eat the leads off completely. Not an engineer in this room would have jammed those leads into copper mesh and stored them there. You said to yourself, that's a dissimilar metal, so is the carbon. Both chemically and electrically, so they threw it out. Now they thought, well, how about metallization? How many of you guys have been in a motel that had a mirror on the ceiling so you can shave in bed? You've been everywhere, haven't you? First time I saw one of them things, I thought I was being attacked by a naked skydiver. Ugly brute, as a matter of fact. You realize if I put a plate glass mirror and it fell on you, it could spoil your entire evening, or in effect cut it short. Well, that's usually a piece of this stuff. You know, it's metallized mylar, man. It don't weigh nothing. You know how they do that? They run this roll of mylar through a huge vacuum chamber with a pump hose big enough to stay ahead of the leaks. First pass out gases it, and then as you roll it back, you got this molten metal in there, and the metal vapor comes up and plates out on that film. Looks to the naked eye like a mirror. To the microscope, it looks like popcorn on flypaper. Like little individual crystals. The way you can tell that isn't a solid piece of aluminum foil. It looks very much like. If I put this over the lady's eye, she can attest you can see through that, can't you? Yeah. Be there? She wouldn't lie. Okay? That's how they make the one-way glass. So they're going to use that, right? Now, what's the biggest use of metallized mylar? It is to make capacitors. And what does a capacitor do? It stores a static charge and gives you a large destructive lump of a discharge when you connect the plates, right? So they actually made drapes out of that trying to stop static. And everything. Trying to stop static discharges with spark-producing surfaces is axiomatically suicidal. That's self-defeating. Everybody understand? And however, they didn't know they were having them. See, if you have an electronic device, they were electronic devices in the early days where in 1964 solid state was just getting off the ground. There was another reason why they didn't know they were damaging electronics. See, if you had that little igniter squib, that little explosive device, and you got a plastic bag near it and it did that, you were pretty well aware, you know, something going wrong, right? I hated to wake you. See, at my age, I have these hot flashes. I had a full head of hair before I started doing these shows, right? What I'm trying to make is if the electronics do this, you would know when something happened, right? See, the time and the place of that failure are not only clear, they're spectacular. You've got a visible sign, an audible signal, a tactile sensation. It took your hand off. It attracted your undivided amoeba, right? Look, the trouble with your electronics is they don't do that for you. How many of you have seen pictures of these things blown up to the size of this blackboard, you know? Oh, incidentally, this is how the water stops static. Suppose if I was to wet those two things, or just wet one of them, if I tried to, those surfaces were wet, right? And this, like this little layer of water on this, as I unroll that, I'd get this layer of water between them, right? And if I tried to pluck off an electron there, it'd go home in a moment of separation, and there wouldn't be any charging. This is why you can't get static by rubbing a wet cat. I have tried it repeatedly. It's also why you don't get zapped as much when the weather is wet. People say, well, that's because the air is wet, and wet air is a good conductor. Wet air is a better insulator than dry air. Surprising, huh? And if you think wet air handles static, go watch a thunderstorm. No, the reason you don't get zapped a lot is because in wet weather, see, in dry weather, plastics do this. Moisture makes little droplets on them, like on your wet car, you know. And the size and the number of those little invisible drops is a measure of the humidity. On a dry day, they don't touch each other. On a wet day, you get big ones, and it begins to look like a sweat layer, don't it? Except it hadn't got your salt. So it's not conductive enough to spark. But it is conductive enough to conduct off the static without making a spark. Everybody see? So we just figured a way to make plastics wet themselves, and we colored them pink, and that's all these anesthetics are. They're just invisibly, evenly, microscopically wet. Like you put the Downy fabric softener in the pantyhose so they don't get affected. Same way, you just coat them with a detergent, and a little trace of it, and that makes them work. Okay? Can't even make them charge. Now, that's why the kids at college are drinking Windex. It keeps them from streaking. That is the worst joke of this entire series. I cannot think of anything else to cover that. Everybody understand? Okay, now, we were trying to get down to what happens inside your devices, though. Look at here. Have you ever seen pictures of your devices blown up to the size of the wall over here? It's still hard to see the map of Sydney in there, all the little electrical connections, right? No matter how fancy they are, inside there, there's always one conductor and another conductor. And between them, we got this layer of gate oxide, you know. At this magnification, you would be roughly 3 million feet tall. These things are small. Right? But leading up to this brute, there's got to be some kind of a lead or it couldn't function, right? Now here I come. I start walking across the floor. Right? Start picking up my feet, separating them. And I get maybe 1,000 volts on my shoe sole, and of that I induce maybe 90 on my skin. And I reach out and I touch that lead with me, or with metal, or with carbon, any one of those three. And I've instantly got 90 volts here and nothing here, right? The alternative is, suppose I don't touch it at all. I'm not even going to touch it. Instead of that, I'm going to bring the instructions on how to keep the place free of static, which I carry around in this vinyl envelope, right? And I'm going to lay that somewhere near that lead, right? Have you ever read one of these? Pick up a static meter, set it at 0. Look at that, man. I'm kicking that completely off the scale, so one of you guys wouldn't have laid this down on the circuit board, fair? Part of the scenery? You didn't see that? Okay, now you've induced it on this lead, right? This feller has now picked up 90 volts, and what happens is, patooey, this spark goes ripping from this conductor to that conductor through that intervening glass, right? Now that happens at 100 nanoseconds or less. That's 100 thousandths of a millionth of a second. Man, that is somewhat rapid, is what that is. It gets incredibly hot in there. There's no time for heat dissipation. See, when that static spark jumps, it's micro-lightning. You get locally intense heat, which is why you can light your lighter with a piezo spark, you know. You get locally intense light, which is why it fogs up film. You get RF, which is what the radio is, right? You can get VHF, you get VHF-I, which is very high frequency indeed. And then you get JWHF, which is Jesus, what a high frequency. In short, you get the whole damn spectrum right there, and that allows a little spark, right? Now, that gets incredibly hot in there. There's no time for heat dissipation. You melt a physical hole through that glass, right? And you vaporize the metal. And the metal vapor does the mirror on the ceiling bit, right? And as it cools out, it coats the walls of this hole, right? And we got us a dead short, and the curved trace says, tilt, bring me another one. Now that's a good clean zap. Like Hemingway said, that one died well. Yeah. It is all over, man. It ain't going to get out of here if QC runs at that chip through every possible configuration of text, right? That's not going to pass. However, it's been estimated that happens to less than 15% of them that get ESD damage. Less than 15% of them die. Okay? Here's what happens to most of them. Take a look at this one. Like the British say, slime again. Slime again. They said that in the pub the other night. He got awfully drunk out. Look, this time the lead is a little shorter. The antenna's not quite so long. This time the plastic bag isn't quite so large or quite so close. This time I took one less step on the rug. This time the humidity is up a little bit. Any one of these factors. And I end up with 80 volts instead of 90, right? And patooey, the spark goes through here, and this time the metal vapor stops. Maybe halfway down the walls of that hole. It hadn't shorted it yet. Now that device, ladies and gentlemen, is pregnant. It is carrying a failure around with it. It'll give birth to it a little later on, man, after a term which varies. Unfortunately, that passes every test in your house with highly acceptable, it's like that typical test results. It works, functions. And then 3 days later, or 3 months later,
or if you press the button to leave the surface of the moon, that thing throws up its little feet and dies. How many of you guys have said to yourself, it was all right when it left here? Come on, it was all right when it left here. It didn't happen on my watch, Captain. Come on, man, it took NASA 8 years to find that. They call it degradation, walking wounded, latent failure. I like to call it pregnancy. You can relate to that. And when you've been pregnant for 5 seconds, there's very little indication of it. Fair enough? You may be tired, but there's very little indication. Okay. It happened in both cases for one reason, man. It was a spark, right? And the name of this game is Let There Be No Spark. Is that straightforward? Okay. So you got to get rid of anything in your plant that can make a spark. Now, only 3 things make sparks. They're metal, carbon, and you, and they can't get rid of you, right? However, there are 2 ways I can stop something from throwing a spark at a doorknob over here. One of them is to wet the rug I walked on, right? In which case I couldn't charge, right? You can do that to plastics. You can buy the pink ones that are always wet, right? Other thing is, suppose I do have the charge and I got to touch that doorknob and the radio over here must remain completely silent. There's only one thing to do, and that's paint the doorknob to cover up the exposed metal so it can't accept the spark. Everybody understand? Okay. You want to find out if you have a shield. How many of you guys have heard of shielding bags? Static shielding bags and stuff like that? You want to find out if you have a shield, you can fall back on the ESD Anderson Effects ESD Spark Detector and Shielding Evaluator. We make a bag called RCAS 3600, but it costs 3 times as much as RCAS 12. Layer of aluminum foil. Ah, shut up. Got a layer of aluminum foil in there. Is that shielding as you understand it, man? That shuts that thing up. That's a Faraday cage, right? Radio don't play in Faraday cage. Not too long ago, 3M came out with a bag they called a static shielding bag. How many of you guys have heard these things? Got the blue metal on the outside, nickel on the outside. So you gotta have that. This is lined with big poly without the big. Gotta have to see. Gotta have to see it. Now, if that's a shield, I'll eat your hat. You might bother to check them out one day. Also, if I walk across the floor and touch that metal, the radio inside that thing cracks like a rifle shot, right? You begin to see the difference? So understand how they work. If you want static shielding bags, we make them, and quite a number of other people do, but with the metal buried, like they buried that foil, so you can't touch it. But 3M says, well, wait a minute, man, you can measure this, you can put a dime over here and a dime over here and connect it with an ohmmeter, and you can prove that's conductive. I got a better test for you, sir. You want to take that? You pick up the bag, and I'll pick up this one. You got the same amount of metal, but it's buried between the walls, like an insulated wire, right? Both of us will stand in the bathtub and touch 220 with our respective bags, right? Survivor to have the business, all right? Don't do that, okay? We kicked that stuff out of Cape Kennedy in '64. Now, how many of you guys seen one of these? See, I didn't know what this was. You'd be amazed what I thought that was. About 10 years ago, I was walking to Texas Instruments, and I said, what is that large hunk of blue ABS with a Teflon tip? Do it on a table that shouldn't have chargeable plastic on it. I said, that thing sucks. I said, how does it do that? He said, well, it's a vacuum pump. It gives hickeys to midgets. I said, we got too much solder on this joint. He says, slurp it off, man, and it cleans that joint up real good. By the time he was telling me how safe that was, he cranks the business into this thing down in intimate contact with the lead of a device that a 12-volt discharge would destroy, right? And he triggers it. And you get a 5,000 to 10,000 volt spike delivered down the throat of the thing you're working on every time you do that. Fortunately, this generally happens during rework, right? You're taking out the bad one. Yeah, love it. We went to the guys that made them and said, look, metal plate that because this is not going to touch anything but the guy, right, not the device. The plug is now Velostat plug, but the tip is Teflon with just enough bronze or carbon powder in it to make it semi but not sparkingly conductive, right? Same device, doesn't wiggle a meter, right? If you have any of these anywhere in Northern Telecom's workstations or repair kits, ship them to your competitor with your compliments. All right? Oh, how many of you guys have seen this stuff? This white cushioning material, you know, the toy for vice presidents. We pop the bubbles. It keeps us happy by the hour. Now, man, you know what that'll do to a static meter. People wrap up a circuit board in this thing, you know, because it wouldn't do to break it. And it gives it what is called the Anderson effect, which was named after me in 1968. We took a neon bulb and spread its leaves out, you know, right and left, and the lady can hold it by the glass, and I can unroll Scotch tape up here about an inch away from that thing that lights up in your fingers, man. And the radio will count the sparks. Let me show you how that works. It may be a little hard to do because I haven't got a bulb with me. But we got a little neon bulb built into what looks like a circuit board. You want to hold this by the glass, just by the size that way, believe me. Now watch this. We got to set the radio, and radios hear sparks, right? This is full up, but it's off of a station. The lady will hold that for just a minute. Notice that when I unroll the Scotch tape, that radio don't make any noise because we haven't any sparks yet, right? But you turned your lights down, and the thing held it like this, and I unroll this near this. This is 5,000 plus here. But I want you to count the sparks and listen to the radio. That isn't one zap, that's several $100,000, and that neon bulb is flashing every time that goes click. So the plain plastics that sneak onto your table are thousands of times as dangerous as your finger ever thought of being. Is that straightforward? But your finger's a single shot, right? This has got an infinite number of them. How many of you seen the same stuff pink? You know, you see pink stuff? The reason that pink is there is so you shan't ever have any of this, right? So if you see a piece of that, you come unglued about it and have somebody fetch you a static meter and check it out, okay? Everybody see that? So you can watch that table real close. Hey, when they gave you the ground straps, what did you think? You can't go for coffee, right? You know the worst offenders are the test engineers. I know how this works. I don't have to wear that stupid strap. I'm above all that, fair? How many of you guys heard that, right? I had a guy working for me one time cut through a 220-volt power cable with a pair of garden shears. He lit up the area pretty good, man. I mean, we picking this guy up off the ground. We said, man, don't you know better than that? He said, man, I thought I'd cut through it right fast. Let go before the juice got there. Man, you can laugh, but any one of you engineers that thinks he can get his finger off the circuit board in 100 billionths of a second is the fastest gun in the FBI, and you just join that man's middle category, man. Ain't any exception to that. Look, you're sitting there wearing your ground strap. If you approach that table, you put that ground strap on, right? It must contact your sweat layer, never over your clothing. So your sweat layer's got to go to the ground through a safe resistance that's built into the strap. Now, you can attach it anywhere on the naked skin. You can attach it to the staple in the girl's navel. They all have them. I've seen them in them Playboy centerfolds. But you've got to connect that sweat layer to the ground, right? Okay, now, and if you're sitting there wearing your ground strap, you put that on when you approach the table. I don't care if you're working on peanut butter. You put on the dadburn ground strap, right? And it becomes a habit. Now the chairman of the board walks down and leans over your shoulder for something. You hand him the wrong end of the soldering iron. That's your table, honey, you know. You defend it against all comers, right? Understood? He's got 100 billionths of a second to get his finger off that board. It don't know from his salary or his position in life. It won't know what's on that pinky. Okay, everybody understand? No exception. Now, as long as these boards are wrapped up in pink polyethylene or shielding bags with the shielding buried, they smell like a rose. Man, you can play basketball with them, right? The only time you undress them is when you're sitting there wearing your ground strap, right? Everybody see that? Now, one other thing. You go through the place and you look for pieces of this. How many of you have seen the notebooks with the acetate or half acetate covers here. You know, you turn those, and the static meter goes 8. Use paper naked. Paper's okay. Repeat after me. Paper and cotton and wood together. Paper and cotton and wood. Forget them. At the speeds at which you can move them, paper and cotton and wood will not produce electrostatic discharge tests. In a high-speed press, people observe problems with paper clanging together. But as far as you're turning the pages of a book, or opening a corrugated carton, or wiping something off with Kleenex, you are not going to damage it. However, a lot of people think so. But the girls know you don't have to put Downy fabric softener in cotton. It's in spun plastics that get affectionate, right? The nylons or the dacron, right? That's why the girls in powder plants are required to wear cotton underwear. You come in here in nylon, honey, you can kill us all. I remember the inspector who was checking for that was pulling down $500 a month. But she hadn't had a job all that long. It's an interesting thing, and it's quite real. So paper and cotton and wood you can forget, okay? But don't wrap up a piece of paper in a nice piece of shiny acetate film, you know, and turn that page and lay the circuit board on top of that, because the whole board gets charged to 10,000 volts. That doesn't hurt a thing. As soon as you touch it, one of those leads goes to 0, and you just blew it. See what I mean? Okay, it's impossible. Oh, signs came out. I got to do this right quick. Signs came out. You think he writes a sign where nobody can mistake it, right? Caution! Static can damage components. Wrong. Static discharge can damage components. Do not handle unless the wrist strap is worn. Somebody at IBM got up and said, what if the wrist strap is new? There was a sign in a restaurant across the way said, no pets allowed except seeing eye dogs. You see no? Think about it. Who's that for? The man can't see and the dog can't read. Sign in my motel said, please place curtain inside tub before using shower. I did that. Took me 20 minutes to get off them little hooks, but I did it. Now you got to think about something. Do not let clothing or plain plastics near these devices, right? How do you know it isn't the plain plastic? Well, it's not pink. Okay, pink is the flag color for anesthetics, okay? Now, it's up to your management to pick the pinks, because there's a lot of them that are no good. But pink became the flag in 1966 when we made the first one of these, called RCAS 1200. Stood for Richmond Corporation Anesthetic, and my birthday was at 12. And 100 made it look like a bigger act. Kind of weird. But since that time, every rocket that's flown in the United States has been covered with that, or its first cousin, which is an anesthetic nylon we make called RCAS 2400, because it costs twice as much. We had a complex way of naming things. But the point is that pink became the flag color, all right? And that sounds like a kind of sissy. You know, it belongs, that color has haunted me for 18 years. Of all the sexy colors for an industrial use, right? Belongs in a nursery or a bedroom, any way you play that one. The guy that introduced me in Rockwell when we draped the first spacecraft in that pink polish said, Anderson, I don't care what they say about your color. I think it's darling. However, pink became the flag color. See, and it turns out that's not a bad idea. See, if you walk aboard a battleship and something is pink, you either worry about the crew, or you figure that's pink for a darn good reason. Man, you'd expect to find blue, green, chartreuse, pink. You see, it's an unusual color. So that's why so many people make pink foams, pink cushioning materials, right? And that means a flag color. Now, unfortunately, your management has to check that, because there's some very bad pinks on the market. But you at least know if it ain't, the worst guy in here can tell if it's either pink or it ain't. And if it's pink, it's generally safe if management chose it properly. Understood? Okay, you've been a very nice audience to put up with me. I want you to know that of all the audiences I have ever addressed, this is certainly one of them. It's nice to be among you all again, honey. And come down and see us you all one day. Thank you. And God bless you.
Howdy. I am some strange fellow by the name of Dan Anderson, and I'm vice president of an outfit called Richmond Division of Dixico in Redlands, California. I'm something of an authority on anti-static plastics and procedures since we invented them about 1966. And I've been asked to come down to Rockwell International's facility at Anaheim to review and survey their static elimination procedures and their static control procedures and their most sensitive, most delicate electronic assembly areas because of one simple thing. Electrostatic discharge damage, a very, very old force, has suddenly gotten up on its hind legs and begun to haunt the space age and the electronics world by damaging the very sensitive and delicate electronics that go into the microelectronics of today. And now it's suddenly a brand new set of rules into how these must be handled and how they must be treated to avoid this very kind of damage. And that has to be taught to everyone who will ever come near them or handle them or assemble them. And so it is very nice to take a look at their procedures, sort of workstation by workstation, to see what these are like. Let's go and do that. Now we're in the area itself, and we're sitting at a practice workstation set up to simulate the actual stations at which the actual assemblies are done. You might have noticed that the first sign that you saw there was directed to the visitor. It said, keep your lunch hooks off the people and off the devices on these tables. Don't touch them. Because when you walk in, you are untrained personnel. The people who work in these areas are trained superbly with anti-static techniques. But if you walk in and carry a charge on you and touch something on that board, you have perhaps 100 billionths of a second to get your finger off that board before you have done irreparable damage to it. So it requires a little training. The other sign that we sometimes see is set up at the workstation. That's directions to the person who works at that station. It says, in effect, caution, static can damage components. Do not handle unless the wrist strap is worn. And that wrist strap that touches the skin connects you with the earth so that no matter how much static you try to build up on your body, you're attached to the world's largest object you can get a hold of, and you will never have any charge on your skin other than that of the world itself. That connection is always made through a safe resistance so that you're not hard grounded, and it's perfectly safe to handle equipment with charges on it or with current on it because it will not shock you. Now, the next business is to look at the tabletop itself. The tabletop that this has been selected here is one which is static dissipative. Notice that it is not conductive like metal or carbon would be because they are too conductive. A device or a circuit board could not be probed on that surface because it would dead short it. Secondly, if a device had a small charge on it and fell upon that table, it would discharge to that metal or carbon too swiftly in the form of the very spark we're trying to avoid, whereas this table will not charge and it will not spark. There is a layer of metal underneath it, but it is never exposed on the surface. It is safely buried. You may have noticed that the young lady has lent me her anti-static smock with a minimum of struggle. See, you can't walk under a table really wearing natural garments like Angora sweaters or things like that if they're going to come near the devices, because your clothing can generate a certain amount of stuff, and that can be induced on very sensitive leads and electronics. And so you have to wear a smock that is either treated or specially made to be anti-static. Now, when I walk up to the table, one of the most important things is to make sure that I put on the ground strap, and the reason is this. When you want to check the static on someone's hand, you put a static meter, set at 0, right on the table like that. Set it at 0, put your hand above that, and then kind of wipe the sole of your foot on the floor. If that meter moves because the static that was formed by the separation of my foot from that floor was then induced on my skin and therefore brought up to the table. Okay? Now, to make sure that that static from my hand doesn't go anywhere except to the earth, we put on a ground strap. And ground straps come in different kinds. This is the Fred strap with the Spidell band, was developed by Fred Mickinen of Honeywell and is therefore called the Fred strap. We have one designed by a Frenchman named Jacques we don't talk about a lot, but this one works very, very well. Now, if you put that on, it must touch your skin. Otherwise, your sweat layer would not reach the earth. But you notice when I put that on, I cannot move the meter, no matter how hard I try or what I'm standing on, because my skin is at absolute zero. Now, if you were working on a live piece of equipment that had current on it or a power supply, you wouldn't want to get that metal strap up against that because it would cause a dead short and get somewhat spectacular. So there are other kinds of straps that are made. This one has a soft conductive layer in the inside of the strap, but not on the outside. That's a stretch band, and it wears comfortably against the skin, never over your clothes. If you put it over your clothes, you would have lost connection with the sweat layer. So it must always touch your naked skin and snuggle up against you like that. And when I have that on, I can no longer move that meter. If there was a break in that strap, or I were even to reach over and disconnect that strap, suddenly I can do that again, you see? So you must always wear the strap, and it must be plugged in or connected to a good ground. There's always a resistor in that strap that keeps you from being shocked if you should touch live circuitry, but the static goes right on through it and doesn't even notice the resistor. The resistor's in there for safety. These are perfectly safe to wear, and you must put them on if you approach the table. The second thing you must do is to remember that if the chairman of the board walks up to that table and reaches for something on it, what you should do is hand him the wrong end of the soldering iron. Because no matter what his education or his salary, he has 100 billionths of a second to get his finger off of that board before he can damage it irreparably without any feeling or without any sound and without any signal. So he has got to put on a wrist strap too before he touches anything on that table. I brought along a few props. Here at Rockwell, they realized that you should only touch a circuit board when it's naked or exposed if you are wearing your ground strap. And you can do that at a specially controlled table where you're trained to do that, but that board must eventually leave the table and go somewhere out into the wide world where it can be touched by perhaps untrained people or exposed. So they always surround each circuit board with an anti-static barrier bag. Now, originally that was just a translucent layer of pink polyethylene. Then they wanted even stronger shielding, so they went to metal layers. And now when you try to stop everything, including a Tesla coil, when you're dealing with the most sensitive devices they use a barrier with a layer of aluminum foil in it. The inside and the outside are anti-static polyethylene and anti-static Tyvek. The aluminum layer is not exposed where it could spark or short, but even a radio put inside that bag will quit receiving. That's a perfect barrier to moisture and to electrostatic discharge or to electromagnetic wavelengths like RF. Now, when that comes to the table, the girl wearing the ground strap opens it for the first time and takes out the practice board in this case. Everything is at the same polarity. She couldn't hurt it if she tried. The gentleman working here, the engineer, cannot hurt it. If you set this on this table, there is no problem, and you're ready to go to work on it with your grounded soldering irons or whatever and make the necessary repairs or adjustments or assembly steps. And then, as soon as you are through with that thing, it goes back into the bag. The bag is folded over, and the material is then stored in perhaps a tote box. In this case, it's pink. Pink is generally the color code for antistatics. When you look at pink foams and pink this and that, that began about 1966, and it's pretty well the generally accepted color for antistatic plastics. However, you have to know who made it. In other words, there's some very bad pinks and some very good pinks, and it's up to your management to pick those. There are also some rather good blue anti-static materials, but you at least should know about them. At any rate, this will not charge nor spark. A conductive box would spark if it was touched, but this is put in here and stored. Now, as long as it's surrounded by that bag, you can play basketball with that thing, although you wouldn't do to break it. As far as the static is concerned, it is perfectly safe as long as it's in that bag. Now, you carry that around in an anti-static box. What you don't carry it around in or bring near the table is a non-anti-static box like this one. That's a common plastic tote box. It looks perfectly innocent. It's an insulator. One thinks that you couldn't do anything with that. But the lid of that is butyrate. If you pick up that butyrate plastic and just bring it near the meter, you can see what the immediate result is. That's enough to wipe out devices all day long. But as soon as you can, you replace those boxes with permanently anti-static types, never with grossly conductive ones, which will cause sparks. You know, one of the things, remember you couldn't bring that standard tote box to that table because it's plain plastic, and plain plastic can charge up enough to cause you all sorts of trouble. How many of you have seen this floating around the plant? This is not an anti-static, but a cushioning material that is designed to keep circuit boards from breaking. They wrap them up in that. But if that's even brought near a meter, you've got enough to wipe out circuit boards all day. So this material should never come anywhere near your plant. There are 3 or 4 very good manufacturers making that pink and anti-static, and the premium is virtually non-existent. There's absolutely no excuse for bringing any of this into your private table, and preferably not into the county where you're dealing with anti-static materials. The funny thing is that you are now vice president as you're working at this table. You're vice president in charge of that table, and you keep everybody else away from it, right? You defend it against all comers. The other thing is that from that table, you have got to make sure that all regular, plain, chargeable plastics are kept away. When you look at a piece of plain plastic bag like that, your reaction should be snake, because that stupid little piece of plastic is able to kill your little devices. You won't hear them go, and all your work is for nothing. They either get damaged where they die good, or you make them where they die later. You will in neither case feel or hear or see anything. And your grounding strap certainly does not ground that non-conductive material, so you simply have to use materials which cannot be charged. Now, you see white foams lying around that are easily changed by using pink foams, which are available from many manufacturers. All very good anti-static, and they are always checked out by your management to make sure that those properties are good or permanent and non-corrosive, but generally they're color-coded pink so that you can spot them. One of the worst things we always run into, and it's sort of ironic, is that when you go into a place that's bought $1 million worth of conductive floors and earth grounds going 8 feet down into the bedrock, and they're carrying their instructions on how to keep the place free of static around in the common shop traveler that is an invisible part of the scenery. But you can see what that's doing to that meter, right? Now, either use the papers naked, because paper and cotton and wood at the speeds at which you can normally move them are really no realistic source of static electrical discharge damage. It is the plain plastics that nobody sees, okay? So either use the papers by themselves, or you wrap them up in a pink version of that, like a pink bag, just a plain pink polyethylene bag of an approved brand, and even in a shop traveler that is specially made for that. See, that replaces that shop traveler, and it will not generate static nor cause a spark under any circumstances. But for heaven's sake, go through the plant looking for this. Anytime anybody brings a plastic bag full of nuts and bolts to your private table, you should react again like sneak. It isn't pink. It isn't anti-static. And you holler for your supervisor, bring me a static meter. And he will give you brownie points and pats on the back and attaboys for finding things that he didn't see, because they're part of the scenery often, and you are paying closer attention to your own table than anybody else can. So it's your responsibility to watch for that. Okay? And the lady wearing the ground strap is undressing her microscope. But you notice even the microscope cover is made out of pink anti-static plastic, because a plain vinyl microscope cover brought near that could kill it. Now she's sitting there working. Ma'am, can I see that for just a minute there? Can I?
No.
Gee, you taught the Marines to fight dirty, didn't you? That didn't go that way at rehearsal. Look, you just earned your brownie points, because, look, that's exactly what you have to do. You defend that table against all comers, because if anybody walked up with a charge on him, he could do strange things. Look, this is a little liquid crystal display. It's one way you can make static visible. It's like the thing in a watch, you know, that does the counting and everything. Hold it by this end, just so that you hold the leads. And if you notice that if I walk up and move my foot on the floor, I can make that thing play the chimes, right?
Yeah.
But if I touch you, I can't do that, because we have connected our sweat layers, which is occasionally fun, okay? You notice that I can also reach over and ground myself with a ground strap to any good ground, and I can't do that. But if I let go and just walk up, that thing is going to live about 100 billionths of a second. So you defend that table against everybody, all right?
Okay.
And you keep the plain plastics off of it, just like you got rid of that old microscope cover. And if you see a piece of plain plastic that isn't pink or isn't anti-static, you come unglued and holler for your supervisor. What's your supervisor's name?
Doug.
You holler, Doug, in a loud voice. Let's hear that.
Doug!
Yeah, fetch me a static meter, huh? That's the way to go. You remember that, you're way ahead of them.
All right,
Thank you. To sum up, you want to walk through an area every now and then and check on the do's and the don'ts. You go on what we call plastics patrol or ESD patrol. The first thing you do is check that the wrist strap is being worn by everybody, snug up against the naked skin, and is attached to a good ground through a safe resistor. You can check that with a meter, or you can check the continuity of the strap with little measuring devices like the Zap Flash. Anything that makes sure that ground is good. Now, you've always got to remember to keep those circuit boards surrounded by static protective bags, and sometimes they use the word Faraday cage. Now, Faraday cage is really a wire structure or a steel structure that stops a radio from receiving. So the true Faraday cage is the ultimate barrier you're using over there with the layer of aluminum foil, because it makes a radio be quiet when it's inside there. It quits receiving. That means it's a very good shield indeed. But there are transparent shields, which are sometimes advertised as Faraday cages. These can be used in less critical areas, but you must always make sure that their metal is not exposed on the outside where it can spark or short, but buried between the layers, for the same reason that the tabletop is not openly exposed conductive. Finally, you don't use carbon-loaded tote boxes or bags for the same reason. The anti-static box, as you can see here, neither one of these would charge a static meter, but this lights up with my sweat layer connecting it, and anything that will do that will throw a spark. The anti-static box is conductive enough not to charge, but it will not throw a spark. It doesn't even light that meter. However, the little Zap Flash responds quite nicely when a black, open, exposed, conductive box is touched. And the same way a device could discharge too quickly to that and cause it to die. The other thing is, you don't allow visitors in your area break their arms if they reach over your shoulder. Check for plain pieces of plastic in the area. Somebody forgot to take that away. That's a plain piece of plastic draped over a device that's not particularly sensitive, but that device, while it's not damaged, the piece of plastic might fall near a real circuit board and kill it very quickly. Some things you can't destaticize readily, and one of these is Scotch tape or the tapes you use to screen or put over leads sometimes when you're plating or doing things like that. And there's no way to destatize those. They do not come antistatic, and they're not conductive. And in certain areas, you must therefore use ionizers. Here are a couple of them. This one has a blower on it and puts out a stream of ionized air right in the general area where you're working. This is one that doesn't require a blower, and it puts out a stream of balanced ions all day long. What happens is that all of these populate the air with ions that are able to neutralize charges on plastics that you can't ground. Like if I unrolled a piece of Scotch tape, it would peg a static meter, and I could light neon bulbs with that right down the throat of the best air ionizer in the world. So what you must do is to pull that tape off slowly and away from the device, come over here and wash it for a moment in the flood of ions. That neutralizes it, and you can check that with a meter and find out how long you had to do that before the charge was neutralized, and then you can safely put it on the board. But you must always give ions time to work. They do not work instantaneously. They are very good for the general area. They actually clean up the atmosphere in some ways by taking dust out of it and sometimes make you feel better. But your management will pick those ionizers very carefully for their efficiency. They even make rather good systems that will ionize the whole room and make the static generation not last as long on clothing or otherwise ungroundable things. But none of these ionizing systems permits you the casual use of common plastics. You still have to observe those precautions. In a word, the one most important thing you can do is clear your area of common plastics and replace them with everyday available antistatic ones which can neither charge nor spark from several manufacturers, and your management will pick them for you, but learn to recognize them. See, where things are particularly critical, you don't bring your food in, for heaven's sake, because it could be wrapped in saran wrap. You don't bring a vinyl purse into the area because it charges tremendously. One of the cutest things is take a simple static meter and set it on a table, and they don't let you smoke in certain of these areas because, look, the cellophane off of the cigarette can blow that circuit board all day. It isn't the paper, it's the plain plastics. Paper and cotton and wood you can forget about. Never paint a simple cardboard box or corrugated carton with black lacquer because you just made a doorknob, a sparker, out of a perfectly innocent cardboard box that couldn't have hurt you in 1,000 years. Do learn to recognize the things and pay very close attention to it. And remember, you are vice president in charge of your table. Good luck, thank you, and God bless you all.